In today's lesson, we're going to talk about the Anunnaki. Now, this is a topic that I obviously like to dive into in multiple lessons. We've touched a little bit on some of the previous topics. Today, we're going to dive into it a little bit more thoroughly. Now, the topic of the Anunnaki is something that's obviously coming to us from these ancient Sumerian cuneiform tablets that seem to parallel many of the modern day biblical tales that we have in either the Hebrew version or the English version, the New King James Version. So I think it's very interesting to realize that a lot of the tales that we have in this consolidated biblical version of today can be found in these earlier Sumerian versions. And the Sumerian versions are very specific about a time when the giants were among us, or a time when we lived amongst these gods we called the Anunnaki. So many of these consolidated biblical references of angels, or again, a time when giants walked upon the earth, I think we're talking about this Sumerian epic. Now, what's really interesting, though, is that it appears that the Anunnaki visited Earth hundreds of thousands of years before these interactions with the Sumerian culture. So we'll kind of start off talking about that, the reasons why they came to Earth, and see if that doesn't shed some more light into what could be possibly coming in the future with these interaction with these Anunnaki beings. Now, we know that they came here 450,000 years ago to mine gold. As the texts explain, the Anunnaki, in their own rise to a technological civilization, damaged their planet Nibiru. They damaged the atmosphere of Nibiru. Now, by taking fine particulates of gold and precious metals, the Anunnaki found that they could repair Nibiru's dwindling atmosphere by patching it with these particulates of gold. Now, even today, we use gold in our spacecraft and various things as insulating technology, even in our computers. So it makes sense that they would be utilizing gold to repair their atmosphere in this fashion. So the texts get very specific in explaining that they originally came to Africa and found large deposits where they set up mining outposts hundreds of thousands of years ago, where the Anunnaki themselves were mining the gold out of southern Africa. They quickly realized that mining the gold themselves was quite a toil and didn't enjoy doing it. So they rebelled. Several Anunnaki rebelled to Enlil and Enki, the main leaders, and said, listen, we're sick of mining the gold ourselves. Why can't we create a robot or fashion a being to do this mining for us? So they decided to take the natural Neanderthal man that was evolving here on Earth and simply combine part of their genes, 80% of the Anunnaki genes, with the base 20% of the Neanderthal here to create us in their image and after their likeness. And as we'll discuss, they literally are our gods in creating us to be like them. So we'll come back to that topic. But clearly the evidence shows that if we were created to do the mining of gold, the mining operation started hundreds of thousands of years ago in southern Africa. Now, Michael Tellinger has also been looking at several of the sites in Africa and realizing these might be connected to or speaking about some of these ancient mines that we know were found in southern Africa. So there is kind of a large gap in time from the recorded time frames geologically that we see mining taking place in southern Africa, as well as mitochondrial DNA evidence that we've now put forth to say mankind that looks like us shows up in southern Africa 300,000 years ago. There was a Time magazine article called The Mitochondrial Eve, where using mitochondrial DNA, which is only inherently passed down through females, we can see that the mutation that looks like us first shows up in southern Africa 300,000 years ago. So very close to the Sumerian information that the Anunnaki originally came here, were mining these gold, these various places in southern Africa, and then created us in their image and after their likeness to do the mining for them. It seems very interesting that even to this day, when we look at gold or we hold gold, it's so precious to us and we get a sensation from seeing it. So from the time that the Anunnaki got here, 450, 300,000 years ago, up until the Sumerian time, which is just 6,000 years ago, there is a large gap that we're still trying to uncover. Now, Many other sites around the world, like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, or the Easter Island, the Moai Heads on Rapa Nui there are locations all around the world that we're starting to uncover and realize civilization goes much further beyond 4000 BC, 6000 years ago, the Sumerian culture. But we're going to heavily look at the Sumerian culture because the evidence that they've left us about the Anunnaki is overwhelming. No other culture outside of the Hindus and their talks of the Mahabharata and various gods and flying around in Vimana, the Anunnaki are really well documented from the Sumerian civilization and give us a wealth of information into the insights of these beings. Now, we see all over ancient Sumerian times, again, this is roughly today, Iran, Iraq, many of these Middle Eastern countries have this type of a wall relief inscribed in places where it's not even very easy to reach. This was on the side of a cliff, very difficult to even reach to film. But you can see a very eloquent scene. There's even Sumerian cuneiform hieroglyphs and text, inscribed here. But this classic scene of what appears to be a being on a winged disc coming down. This is depicted all over the Middle Eastern countries, where it seems to have originally started in Sumer, this influence of these beings, the Anunnaki, always being depicted coming down in this winged disc and interacting with the people below them. So we have to understand that the Sumerian culture is literally the oldest civilization that we currently have on record. Now, as I've stated, we are finding remnants of older cultures going back 13,000 BC, maybe even as well as 50,000 BC, but not a complete civilization like we found in ancient Sumer. And again, what's really interesting about this is the wealth of information that we have, their daily routines and things that they went through, but also sacred information, thousands of tablets, where they claim to have interacted with these beings, the Anunnaki. A high priest would sit with a scribe in front of an Anunnaki, and the high priest would take and hear sacred information told by the Anunnaki to the high priest, and the scribe would be furiously writing this all down. So we have all of this information preserved, still in stone, of what the Sumerians learned from the Anunnaki. Now, the famous author, Zecharia Sitchin, was really one of the first to come under controversial, to basically start a controversy, if you will, over these lost texts, these ancient Sumerian tablets. And really, even today, Zecharia Sitchin still gets a lot of skepticism. But you have to understand there's two ways to argue this ancient astronaut theory. There's the visual information. We have artifacts and pyramids and this sort of thing. But then there's also the linguistic information, the actual written word. Visual references, written word. Two separate tracks that one can look at to understand what's happened in the past. Now, the written word is a little bit more controversial than the artifacts and visualizations. We can all see what a pyramid looks like a pyramid, or something that looks like a winged disc appears to be representing flight. But the text, this is where there's always been a divergence, where people who try to speak against Zecharia Sitchin or speak against Eric von Daniken. Well, Eric von Daniken's always been the visual guy, showing all the visualizations of monuments and artifacts around the world. Zecharia Sitchin has always been the linguistic guy, the guy that understands the actual translations. I guarantee you, many of the people out there that claim to refute Zecharia Sitchin spent 50 years, 50 years looking into these topics. Raised in Palestine and being able to speak and translate Hebrew directly, he had a much more intimate knowledge of these Semitic languages, these Middle Eastern languages. He was able to actually translate cuneiform script. There's only about 400 people in the world today that can accurately translate cuneiform script directly. I guarantee you, most of those authors out there today talking against Zecharia Sitchin do not translate cuneiform script. Now, having said that, that's just the linguistic information, the words. And if you want to squabble over the meaning of the term Anunnaki or Nibiru, or properly interpret the Enuma Elish, some of these sacred Sumerian texts, then you need to understand the words, the linguistic side. Zecharia Sitchin was a a complete scholar. I have yet to find anyone other than Emiel Maloan and various other Sumerologists that again looked at the linguistic translations, and that can be a debate on its own. But then again, there's this other side, the visual references, and that's where we're going to focus in today's lesson of the Anunnaki, the visual references. This cannot be discounted. It's only open for interpretation. And the beauty of this visual information is we see this ubiquitous. All around the world, there is the same references, beings coming down from the skies depicted with wings. Not just the Anunnaki, Hindu gods, Mesoamerican gods, as well as South Africa, and even, of course, as we're looking into today, the Middle East. So please understand that when you hear people claiming Zecharia Sitchin is wrong or that he's been refuted, no, he hasn't. Maybe one person disagrees with his linguistic translation, but if you ask anybody who has a problem with Zecharia Sitchin, say, do you believe in the ancient astronaut theory in general? I bet they'll tell you no. So keep that in mind when looking at this topic of ancient astronaut evidence. There are the visual references shared across the world from all cultures. Then there's the linguistic information, which requires more of an academic framework to actually play on that battlefield. Now, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the visual references. So when we realize that the Sumerian culture, which existed in this fertile strip of land, Mesopotamia, Babylon, between the Tigris and Euphrates Valley, all of the pictorial evidence that we have of these beings are very consistent. And just like the Egyptian culture, I think that we get more information from hieroglyphic and pictograms than we do from the written word. Most people have to understand that, for instance, Egyptian hieroglyphics are like acronyms. When you see one syllable of a hieroglyph from Egypt, think of it as an acronym like FYI or CIA or NSA. When you instantly see FYI, for your information, you know that it's conveying several words by one small syllable, an acronym. That's exactly what many of these pictograms display, from ancient Sumer as well as ancient Egypt. The visualizations, a picture is worth 1,000 words. This could never be more true. So understand that when we start to look at this information, that it doesn't directly translate to our A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Many of these things are represented in a symbol that represent an acronym of today. CIA, Central Intelligence Agency, narrowed down to 3 words. So that's exactly what we see in a lot of these artifacts. So the symbolic references being displayed to ancient man to us today, again, you could interpret this visualization of a man that has the power of flight. He even has the ability to land, somehow landing gear, and he was in a circular craft, and he was holding circular devices, maybe manipulating some type of gears. How else could they describe what they were seeing without giving it a natural layer to describe it? Bird-like features, landing gear, things that you would see that hold up a table. So very simplistic viewpoints to explain complex things. Now, when we look at this ancient symbology of the Anunnaki, there are several different references. This one is a classic depiction of an Anunnaki that's in charge of the spaceport. Now, you can see they only have one set of wings and kind of a bird-like feature. And this one happens to be holding the fruit of life and the water of life. And symbolically, they have on these wristwatch-looking gear. It could just be a band, but it does look very wristwatch-like. Now, what's interesting to note is there are various types of Anunnaki depicted, some with 2 wings, some with 4, some with human faces, some with bird faces. But I think they're trying to convey to us the power of flight. This depiction, again, being a commander of a spaceport, that's very specific. Now, if we look at the literal interpretation of this information, beings like this were said to have been seen at places like Baalbek in Lebanon. One of the ancient Sumerian kings, King Gilgamesh, talks about, in one of the ancient texts, talks about how he came to this place where the gods descend and ascend from the heaven. And this is where you would see the symbol of this type of an Anunnaki. Here at this one location, Baalbek in Lebanon, we see these large trilithoton stones, stacked to make a platform, which we'll see in a minute. And these are perfect locations to have exactly described what we hear in these stories of a commander of a spaceport piloting these craft that make large flames and smoke and thunderous sounds as they come down or go into the heavens. So this exactly describes what we would call today a rocket launch. So a lot of these things where they're the commander of a spaceport actually are very much in alignment with them trying to visualize these people had the power of flight. Now, when we look at our own symbology of when we landed the man on the moon the first time, again, using an eagle, we're doing it symbolically to say that we have the power of flight, right? Now, it's just like the Anunnaki's description of showing them with wings. It's only to say that they had the power of flight. This is exactly what we conveyed when we first landed the man on the moon, and this famous phrase that was used.
Big shadow. More forward, drift into the right a little. 30 seconds forward, drift. We copy you down, Eagle. The Eagle has landed.
The eagle has landed. Now we have to understand, we'll just go ahead and move on to the next slide here, that there are many references in ancient times to the power of flight. Just like symbolically we were showing that we have the power of flight, it's very possible that we can take a literal interpretation and look at all of this ancient evidence and realize we're seeing the building blocks and the stories to create an actual history of interaction where beings were ascending and descending over and over in front of these ancient cultures that did not have any other way to depict what they were seeing other than to use a natural layer of description, no technological references. But when we look at the evidence, this is exactly what we see as a technological layer of evidence being left. Many of these blocks, for instance, as I just mentioned, Baalbek in Lebanon, these were stones that were quarried several miles away and then carried many miles and stacked in Baalbek in Lebanon to make these large platforms. But as you can see, these rocks weigh hundreds of tons. We would struggle immensely today to literally pull a rock out of the ground this big and then transport it. Very difficult for even modern technology to accomplish something like that. Yet, this is what we see all over the ancient times, is that they were moving these megalithic stones, stones that weigh hundreds of tons, and perfectly stacking them to make these large platform-like edifices. You can see a gentleman standing here next to these blocks to give you a relation to the size. And here's another gentleman, again, standing in relation to these size. These are huge stones. And this type of architecture is, again, worldwide. We see this at many megalithic sites. The ability for them to do, one, use mortarless technology. The stones are all fit together so perfectly, there's no mortar or anything holding them together. And the immensity of the stones. The sheer size is just off the charts. We can't do this today, folks. We can't build and stack stones of this size. How are the ancients able to do it? So when we look at a lot of these sites, again, the architecture and overall planning is incredible. But they also appear to look like, this could just be a ceremonial top. But to me, it very clearly looks like it could be a landing platform, some type of ancient space pad that rockets were ascending or descending from these locations. And it's all fit to have, the perfect place where it's like a big ceremony of watching these launches and things take place. So it's very possible that a lot of these locations are actually describing ancient rocket ships, ancient landing pads, for whatever intents and purpose. I can't tell you that they were anti-gravitic UFOs or some advanced spaceship. What we have are depictions of ancient rocket ships. Now, this seems illogical because we think that advanced alien races or people that would be spacefaring visiting ancient man would be super advanced. We still don't have all the facts. We still don't understand. But what we do know is the correlation of the imagery shown matches our current technology today of gas-propelled rocket ships. Maybe they're using some type of different propulsion. We still don't have all the facts, but clear representations that rocket ships were being seen thousands of years ago. So we just have to kind of reanalyze some of the obvious things that we're seeing right in front of us that very much resemble today a launch pad or a place where we would launch things into space. It requires a very large lifted surface or flat surface to be able to make our craft ascend or descend accurately. And that's exactly what we see in a lot of these ancient sites. So aside from just the actual landing spots, these large landing pads in various locations, we have what appear to be actual space information. Now, I say this loosely because there are the artifacts of what the ancient man was seeing being piloted, the actual craft, but then we have actual astronomical data that we can now confirm as being accurate. This is a tablet being held by Zecharia Sitchin, and it's a very interesting circular tablet, which they didn't even think that ancient Sumerians were familiar with the shape of an ellipse, yet here they are using a circular tablet. Now, on this information, you can see it's very badly weathered, but some of it is decipherable in a couple of locations. And what we get here is some very interesting information. Now you can see under a higher resolution shot of this tablet that a couple of these areas that are not so damaged reveal, again, very interesting astronomical data when translated. This section blown up has what appears to say on the edges, rocket, rocket, mountain, mountain, pile up, high, high, high. The names of the planets like Pluto and Neptune and Uranus all had Sumerian names that were listed on this tablet. And you can see here that there was actual descriptions of the planet course corrections the Anunnaki would have to take when coming from their planet Nibiru, passing by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 planets, coming to the 7th planet of Earth. So they literally explain astronomical course corrections of how they would navigate until they got to the 7th planet, from their planet to Earth. Various information actually talking about space travel on a 6,000-year-old tablet. Now, if that wasn't just the same, the depictions and descriptions that we have of the craft used by the Anunnaki explain these rocket ship-like craft that would be in outer space orbiting, and then a smaller craft would come down and detach to a land on Earth. Exactly the depictions that we have of our modern space capsules. Even in India, we have the depictions of the various Buddha and other sacred beings depicted in these stupa, which again look very similar to a space capsule. So we have to wonder if this Sumerian Shem is the word, or what appears to be an ancient rocket. This is again Baalbek in Lebanon, a rocket being depicted on that large landing pad. Many depictions of these ancient rockets, again, are in alignment with rocket pads or launching pads, these large megalithic sites that we have that would have served perfect places to launch or land these types of craft. And again, we have these depictions coming from all over the ancient world. This was actually inscribed on the tomb of an Egyptian governor. And you can see here that this is land level because there's people and animals and plants and what appears to be the top part of a rocket. And then we can see going underground, just like a missile silo, right? You can see that the other part of the rocket has the living corridors and what appear to be even showers. I mean, what are we talking about here, folks? This is a depiction of a rocket ship from an ancient Egyptian tomb, actually inscribed on his tomb. So these are all over the world. This again is from the tomb of Pakal. And we have what appears to be King Pakal seated in a rocket ship and manipulating levers and gears. His nose is even in some type of breathing apparatus. And you can see even what appears to be flames coming out of the back of this ancient rocket ship. Now again, we have to understand that these depictions make a lot of sense when we look at what we're seeing and think this looks like a rocket ship. This looks like someone preparing to go into the stars, to go into space. Now, with our understandings of space travel today, we have to look at this information and realize that what we're seeing can't be just a coincidence, that this type of visual information, again, visual, is clearly speaking the same story over and over from cultures around the world. Now, again, this ancient rocket ship is, something that we see from various cultures. This one in particular was found in Turkey, I believe, and it was first found by Zecharia Sitchin. And he contacted the curator and said, listen, I understand that you don't want to say it's a rocket ship, but why don't you at least put it on display and let the audience decide? Zecharia Sitchin was able to convince them to put it on a limited basis and show this as an artifact that they couldn't quite explain its purpose, but clearly it has rocket-like characteristics. We see the nose of the rocket ship, a man seated with his knees bent here. He's missing his head, but then clearly rocket-like characteristics. So it really does start to raise a lot of questions. And now specifically when we get into these depictions of the Anunnaki, again, we realize that the biblical interpretation of some of these stories, the English version, we have the Sumerian original version still recorded in stone. This is an actual depiction of the tree of life. And you can see that there's an actual Sumerian tale being inscribed here on the wall with this. And again, this depiction of the winged disc, always prominent. And you can see here like a gentleman piloting it. It's not just the winged disc, it's an actual person in there too. Over and over, and they're pointing up to it. Over and over this is depicted. This has to be some depiction of an ancient spacecraft. They had no way to interpret or understand a flying vehicle other than to depict it the best way they could. A circular craft that had the power of flight, so they give it wings. How else could they explain a circular craft that was flying? Now, what's really interesting about a lot of these tales of the Anunnaki in the biblical sense is, we have the story of Adam and Eve, or the Garden of Eden, or even the Flood Tablet. Again, we have Sumerian derivatives that speak of an Anunnaki doing the same type of story, but thousands of years ago in the biblical reference. So the whole creation story of creating the atom. Now, in the English version, we have, Adam and Eve and taking the rib and various things, but we have actually a word in Hebrew, Adamu, which means worker. And in the Sumerian version, there's an actual god, one of the Anunnaki named Ishtar, and she is actually attributed with making the first atom. There's actually a depiction of her holding up the first version that worked, meaning they tried several models where the arm didn't function or the leg didn't work, until finally they had the perfect working model, which they called the atom. So just like there are 7 days of creation, in the Sumerian version there are 7 tablets of creation. And this is an actual scene depicted of when Ninhursag finally made the perfect working model. She says, "My hands have made it." And you can see that they're like doing something with a jar or holding some type of a test tube with vases. Maybe this was some type of primitive in vitro fertilization process. We don't know. But the evidence clearly is stating that they made us in their image and after their likeness. And if we look at the genetic symbology being depicted from this time of inception of what we use today, it all makes sense. All of this comes from the Sumerian tales. Now, these are various depictions of the god Enlil and Enki. You can see here this double entwined serpent as the representation of the god is being used even today as a double entwined serpent that represents 2 things, medical knowledge, but the symbol of our DNA. All these ancient symbols of entwined serpents, that's knowledge of genetic information. That's saying they understood the power of genetics. Somehow these ancient Anunnaki chose to use the symbol of entwined serpents to depict medical knowledge because they understood they were modifying our DNA. Now, even today, we see this medical symbol used everywhere in times of health or in times of safety. This medical symbol is a representation handed down by thousands of years of knowledge of genetic manipulation to our DNA. Can't just be by chance. So we have to recognize that they did have the power of flight. Now, there's 2 things to note about the Anunnaki. 1, they're always depicted with wings. 2, angels were always depicted with this glow, or would sometimes have a ring above their head, a halo. Well, it turns out the Anunnaki come from a glowing planet. If you are what you eat, Nibiru was a bright glowing planet. It was always symbolized as a red glowing cross in the sky. If the Anunnaki come from a glowing planet, natural luminescence, just like we see here on Earth, there are fireflies or certain fish that have natural luminescence. The Anunnaki had a natural luminescence about them. If you saw an Anunnaki standing in front of you, you'd say he had a kind of a glow about him, an aura. So if we combine the fact of this glow and the idea that they're always depicted with wings, we can realize that a lot of these depictions take on a new meaning. Some of these Anunnaki, again, depicted with the long beard and more human-like and having bull horns and 2 sets of wings, establish more of an authority figure. And there are various depictions, again, where sometimes they only have 2 wings or 4, and various types of headdresses, from the eagle-like headdress to the more human-like headdress. This being the commander of a spaceport, this being more just a general god. So it is very interesting, the subtle nuances. And again, you can see the text inscribed here on the wall describing a tribute to this god. Now, a lot of these scenes, again, we see over and over the same depiction. A platform being built, the humans, or the taxpayers, holding up the platform for the king to have this interaction with the gods. The being always in some type of a winged disc coming down to the god, to greet the god, to depart sacred wisdom. And this scene is depicted over and over all over the Middle East. They went to great lengths in carving these on artifacts and wall carvings. This was something very momentous that took place, not mythology. How else could they describe beings that came to visit them? Now, here's another interesting interpretation. William Henry is another researcher that believes in the idea of stargates and wormholes. But we do see this depiction in various scenes of the Anunnaki, what appears to either be a watery doorway or this symbol of a gateway, some type of wormed infused hole or a door that goes inward. Is it possible that the Anunnaki are literally coming out of a stargate and interacting with ancient man? We just don't know. But a lot of their astronomical data, a lot of their information about the movements of the heavens very accurately show they knew what they were talking about. So when they give reference to this other planet Nibiru, we have to understand that this also is a sacred line of information that shouldn't be discounted. Many people struggle with the term Nibiru today, trying to put it into the proper meaning or context of their own viewpoint, but we still don't understand other than the references from these ancient cultures. And there are over 30 cultures that actually reference a dual sun understanding, which is actually a separate topic from Nibiru, but again, advanced astronomical data. So we see this again being depicted on many walls and reliefs all through Iran and Iraq, where the king and high priests are being held up by the people to see this ceremonial interaction with the winged disc. And, again, this isn't just slapped up on a wall with some graffiti. They went to great lengths to carve these into various precious stones and monuments. So I think it's interesting to look at these, again, various depictions of the Anunnaki, always in intricate detail, shown sometimes with a stylized headdress that's more bird-like, or just more of as a man. But then there's these subtle nuances of 2 wings or 4 wings. And I know this must mean some deep symbolic references to having a higher state of space travel or a higher sense of power, having the double set of wings. But again, there's always this infused astronomical information, this layer of them talking about the stars, the distance between the planets, what the planets actually look like in space. So we're going to look at several artifacts that, again, the visual information is where it's most intriguing. Most of this information, again, is trying to bequeath a lot of information with just a few different symbols. What I can interpret to see here is we see, again, the winged disc. But what we also see are the 7 dots that represent Earth. So all throughout this scene, you can see this reference of the winged disc and the 7 dots of Earth. And this seems to be some ceremonial description of something happening between the gods that are coming from Nibiru to Earth. Now, again, we see this reference of a Sumerian priest leading another Sumerian to greet an Anunnaki and receive sacred information. And you can see that in various museums we have actual translations provided by the Louvre and various museums where these are on display, and they give a very generic description. A goddess stands behind the owner of a seal who is being led by a second goddess before the king, who is seated on an elaborate throne, and just kind of goes on and gives this very mundane observation of what we're seeing. Well, again, looking at some of these through the ancient astronaut lens, we realize that the astronomical references and some of these interaction with these Anunnaki, this couldn't have been just mythological information. They were actually, upholding momentous locations that took place. So that's exactly what we see in a lot of these scenes is sacred information bequeathing when a god or a high priest had this interaction. And there's usually some type of an astronomical symbol present. And again, we have these mundane translations where we can at least get a baseline of description for what these things are representing. So these various artifacts all over the British Museum and the Louvre show the cylinder seal with the reversed carved picture, and then the cylinder seal pressed into the wet clay and then hardened into stone to leave the positive imprint, and sometimes various different stones or just a picture of it. But we have many of these artifacts in complete intact form, the cylinder seal, the tablet, as well as the written texts. So lots of these artifacts that give us the ability to paint a very thorough picture of ancient Sumer. Now, this one I found to be very interesting. Even though it's hard to make out, we see this depiction of what appears to be some type of rod of power. Now, whether or not this is like a rocket ship next to some type of a launching pad, just like today when we launch a rocket, it's next to like a pad that falls away as the rocket goes up. We see these depictions over and over and have to wonder what they're trying to tell us. And again, this is kind of the staple question about depictions with wings is, did they really have wings? Or are they just trying to depict that they had the power of flight? If you think about it, ancient man would have no way to give a technological reference, anti-gravity or a plane. All they could do is reference a bird or things flying in the sky. But they went to another length above that. They gave astronomical references as well. It appears that they watched the heavens over hundreds of years because this interaction with the Anunnaki told them and taught them about this sacred celestial knowledge. We've divided the heavens into 12 parts. You can even see here on this ancient Sumerian tablet various zodiacal references, their knowledge of the 12 houses of the zodiac. And again, this is a much larger celestial time where we see artifacts and astronomical observations that seem to track where ancient people were in this larger 24,000 cycle of time, this 24,000-year cycle of time. In modern times, we call it the precession of the equinox. But our current model is slightly off. And as you'll learn from ancient school, we're looking into a much deeper model to explain this model of precession. So a lot of these tablets, again, were on semi-precious stones, but depicted very interesting tales and always inconspicuously had this winged disc. Now, what we see here is possibly the depiction of the winged disc for the planet where they come from, Nibiru, as well as the crescent moon, the main moon of Nibiru. So it's interesting to see how the symbol of even Nibiru has evolved from originally being depicted as a cross to even in more recent times taking on the symbol of the winged disc. Now, these depictions of flight we see over and over again. We see these depictions coming over and over of the power of flight, always being referenced as some type of flying craft in the sky. And even in some of the most ancient stones that we have, it's very clearly depicted as, again, this winged disc above the population. Various coins and other artifacts memorialize this interaction, and we even see other types of hybrid beings, whether it be the Minotaur, the Sphinx. We have to understand that if there was genetic manipulation on us in the past, some of these other beings that we see depicted as the Sphinx or the Minotaur make a lot more sense that if there was genetic manipulation on us, there could have been genetic manipulation on other species. So a lot of these tablets, again, are just a wealth of information, but are doing it in pictogram form. You can see that these are very badly damaged and hard to decipher, but artists have gone to great detail in kind of reclaiming what we see here. And most times we have these, again, astronomical references, some kind of knowledge that's talking about the stars. Here again, we have the depiction of some type of a being inside of the winged disk, and again, hovering over the tree of life. And we have these mundane explanations, but we just have to wonder, really, what is actually being depicted from their point of view. So the Sumerians left us, again, just a plethora of various tablets and artifacts that speak of a time when they lived amongst these gods, the Anunnaki. And we have to understand that this probably wasn't mythology. There are now even other edifices that we've discovered on other planets, like Mars, that clearly the face on Mars was talked about by the Sumerian culture. There was actually depictions of the Anunnaki using Mars, where they would mine the gold on Earth, weigh it on Mars, and then transfer it to Nibiru. So many of these depictions of what we see Mars being used as a way station or as an outpost make a lot of sense when we realize thousands of years ago there was interplanetary travel taking place by these Anunnaki and leaving their footprints not only on Earth but also on Mars. Looking at the face on Mars as we've done already, clearly this is an edifice that has human-like characteristics, Sphinx-like characteristics. So we really have to wonder about this Mars-Earth connection and understand that this could actually possibly be not a humanoid face, but the face of an Anunnaki. Now, one last couple things I want to point out here is, these helpers of the Anunnaki, various depictions going even as far back to 7000 BC. There are these small statues and figurines that are described in Sumerian tales as being the helpers of the Anunnaki. They would help fly the craft of the Anunnaki or help in medical experiments. We really have to wonder about this information. It really raises a lot of questions in similarity to the modern day gray aliens. So I'm going to kind of wrap it up here in understanding that when we speak of this time when there were giants upon the earth, we have to look back to an older epoch of time, the Sumerian culture, which had existed at 6,000 years ago, or right around 4000 BC. But there is probably a lost wealth of evidence that we still have yet to unearth about the Anunnaki. Stay tuned to learn more. One last thing I'm going to point out is, when we invaded Iraq in 2003, the reason was for nuclear weapons. An off-the-book ufological reason was, many of these times when soldiers were going into Saddam's various palaces, they would find these immaculate scenes where Saddam was paying tribute to the Anunnaki. There were even stories that Saddam wanted to build a theme park dedicated to the Anunnaki. So it makes sense that it is possible that the Iraqi government found some type of ancient technology and was reverse engineering this, and the UN or world governments didn't want them to have access to the type of space technology and things that we do through our reverse engineering. So they went in there under the disguise of, let's get nuclear weapons out of their hands, but they might have been extracting some lost ancient technology. I guess we'll just have to wait and see.